Okay, right, thank you. So, yes, so I'm going to be talking about some work that I've done with colleagues in the University of Nottingham. We're based in the medical school, and I'm an assistant professor in pharmacology there. I like this image as it's a bit of a metaphor for me, in the sense of, so I took on this project a couple of years ago, just after I joined Nottingham. And if you think back a couple of years, George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests and the statues that were being toppled over, and this is something that I've had a lot of statues topple over in my mind as I've gone through this project, and it's been a fantastic learning process for us all, really. So when I say what do we really mean, I mean not just us, but we wanted to try and understand what our students meant when we talked about ethnicity. So trying to teach about ethnicity in medicine, medical science, we really felt that we needed to understand what the students were thinking when we used these terms. So in pharmacology, we teach about prescription of drugs. And the example here is when in the NICE guidelines, this is one of the first things I came up against when I was preparing my first lectures at Nottingham. I had to teach about the differences in prescribing guidelines between blacks and non-blacks. And basically, if you're of African descent, you'll be offered one class of drugs, and if you're not, you'll be offered a different class of drugs. And I remember looking at this and thinking, wow, what's this all about? Why should you have this? And I think it was odd that it struck me as odd, but it wasn't striking anybody else around me as odd. And I think part of that was, I guess, diversity, because I had been teaching in Cambridge actually for many, many years in the graduate entry medicine course here. But I took a few years off to go and be a secondary science teacher, during which I had to teach myself genetics because I'd never done it at school. And that was a learning process. But in doing that, I learned quite a lot of things that some of my colleagues don't necessarily or aren't necessarily aware of. So there's another example in physiology. This is an example in kidney function, where we'll use so serum creatinine, for example. You input that, and then you input their patient's age, and then you'll put in their race. But actually, it's whether they're black or not, which is bizarre. And again, why should this be? Why do we do this? What's underneath all of this? And actually what's in common with both of these examples is that they come largely from population level studies, where there've been samples of different racial or ethnic groups. And then some evidence in evidence-based medicine is put together with a lot of statistical analysis. But essentially it's an observation at a population level. And when you go to look underneath and try and work out, well, what's the underlying mechanism? There's nothing really there. Nobody really seems to have any sort of consensus view. We don't really understand why the hypertension guidelines are as they are. We don't really understand why these GFR or kidney function calculators are the way they are. There's no sort of science that underpins this population level observation, which is a bit bizarre. So this has now changed. So the NICE guidelines for the GFR calculator have now changed to remove race, and that happened last year. The hypertension treatment guidelines, however, remain the same, though there are rumors that they will change. So myself and Shola, who is also at the University of Nottingham, she teaches on some of the other courses. We teach pharmacokinetics. And we decided to do a project looking at inter-ethnic differences in pharmacokinetics. And when we wanted to think about, what should we be teaching about ethnic differences, we were all sort of very attuned to thinking about this. If you think back to the summer of 2020, there was a lot of talk about decolonizing the curriculum. And we discovered, actually, if you looked in the literature, there were lots and lots of potential factors that scientifically were known to underpin observed differences between ethnic groups. But it's worth pointing out, actually, that what we found was that there were more papers showing similarities between ethnic groups. So over 2/3 of the papers were showing similarities, and only 1/3 were showing inter-ethnic differences. So we quickly changed our title to "Is There More That Unites Than Divides?" And we decided to change our teaching to into individual variation in pharmacokinetics, rather than into ethnic differences. Of all of those mechanisms, the one that gets the most emphasis, however, in the literature and generally in teaching in this area is the genetic variants. So there are lots of single nucleotide polymorphisms that change the enzyme activity, so the drug metabolism is changed and the drug excretion is changed. And it worried me that whilst there are all of these factors, the emphasis was on the genetics. That really bothered me. Part of the reason it bothered me was because of having to teach myself genetics again in order to teach A-level biology, because I knew about this thing called genetic determinism, which is this idea or this belief that genetic factors are more important determinants of phenotype than environmental or behavioral factors. And it's known, there's some research that's been done that suggests that the more people have these deterministic beliefs, the more they are likely to have racist behaviors. And there's also a suggestion that if we teach a very simplistic Mendelian genetics, we're more likely to be engendering these deterministic beliefs. So altogether, there's a number of people who are calling for changes to the way we teach genetics. This has been going on for 20 years. We've known about this for 20 years. Why has it not permeated out into the other areas of biology? So I've been spending a lot of my time going to conferences like this, and I've got another one tomorrow in Nottingham, trying to tell other colleagues in the medical sciences that this is a thing, and it's well known and well understood, and actually not really controversial. So there are all of these misconceptions around genetic variation between and within ethnic groups. So I think this Venn diagram shows it quite nicely. Again, this has been known for 20 years. If you look at genetic diversity by population, the African population is the most, or if you talk about people from the African continent, they're the most diverse. But Europeans and Asians are also diverse, and look how overlapping they are. So it's really important to really make sure students understand this Venn diagram. This should be part of, I believe, everybody's education. And I feel like it needs to be part of the education of a lot of my colleagues as well, because a lot of people I talk with are not aware really that this exists. Because we get so much into our silos, we get into our own little fields, and we don't necessarily follow what's going on in other fields. We also started to look into the pharmacology literature, and we found this is one of the SNPs involved in transporting drugs in the liver. So basically it affects the metabolism of some drugs. And you can see that across the different ethnic groups, there's a range of different sort of prevalences, but none of them are exclusive to any particular ethnic group. And this is another common misconception. People think that, well, if you're East Asian, then you're going to be metabolizing that drug that way. And if, do you know what I mean? They're looking for differences, when actually there aren't any distinct differences sitting there. So our research questions were to try and look into understand how our students understand ethnicity, and also to see whether they hold any of these misconceptions around genetics and ethnicity. And actually, I should jump forward and say, at the moment, we're starting to look at staff and to see to what extent staff also hold these misconceptions. So our context is in 112 students from these 4 programs, so graduate entry medicine, and then BSc and MSc programs in pharmacology and physiology. And the study methods, we gave a pre-questionnaire and then some teaching. And there were 3 key points that we wanted to make in the teaching. So we were teaching about pharmacokinetics with our standard learning outcomes. We wanted to make a point that there were these variety of factors that can affect drug metabolism. We wanted to also make the clear point that certain single nucleotide polymorphisms are not exclusive to a given ethnic group. and that on the whole, genetic variation within an ethnic group is similar to genetic variation between ethnic groups. So another way of putting that is to say that if you were to analyze the genomes of lots and lots of people and try to categorize them, you would not categorize them into the continental scale racial groups that we have today. So you wouldn't put them into Africans, Asians, and whites. That just wouldn't make any sense at all. So how did our students understand ethnicity? So we gave them really just a free text question: how would you define ethnicity? And over half of the students said words relating to culture or traditions or place of origin. Some said words relating to appearance, like skin color. Just under a quarter used those words, as well as words relating to genetics and or ancestry. And then only a small proportion actually used words only relating to genetics and ancestry. And then some just said, well, ethnicity is race. And that conflicts really with the use of the word ethnicity in the pharmacology literature, because most of these papers are talking about these continental scale racial groups, I think I would call them. So Caucasians versus Asians, or whites versus blacks, or that sort of thing. And the word Caucasian is not so commonly used anymore, but has been used quite a lot in the past. There are a small number of papers where they've looked, these particularly from Chinese groups, where they've looked at the subnational ethnic groups within China. But most of them are whites versus blacks versus Asians, if to summarize. So we asked students about, in the focus groups, a little bit more, trying to get a bit more nuanced understanding of their ideas and impressions. And it was really interesting just how variable they were. So some students had a very strong sense of ethnicity that was very tightly related to their own family history and experiences. Very proud of their own culture and really felt it was very part of their identity. Whereas other students really felt that they didn't really know what this ethnicity thing was all getting worked up about. That they might have one parent from one country, another parent from another country. They were born in a third country and they'd moved to the UK. That sort of feeling of not really having an ethnicity. So they tended to see ethnicity very much from their own lived experience, which makes a lot of sense. But then when we start talking about it in a medical science perspective, I think we're almost using a different word, is what I'm feeling, but we're using the same word to mean quite different things. They've learned about ethnicity not through any formal schooling. So just really from their own family, from just general things that they see in the media. So no previous, they commented that they'd not previously had any teaching at all about anything to do with ethnicity, possibly with the exception of religious education at school. And I think, some of these students were graduate entry medicine students who already had a degree in biology. So I think it's quite remarkable that you can go all the way through a biology degree and not really talk at all about ethnicity. So we asked, trying to get at a bit more at what they were thinking about some of these ethnic differences in the hypertension guidelines, first of all. And we asked them, how would they speculate, what would they speculate these mechanisms to be? And they said largely both genetic and environmental, which is sort of what you'd expect. You'd see that from what, if you look at the school biology curriculum. But we also asked what they would anticipate the mechanisms for drug metabolism differences might be. And this is something that we wouldn't expect them to know very much about. So they really are just sort of speculating what they think. And I guess it's not actually, I wasn't surprised that the responses were mainly genetic. Some saying both environmental and genetic, but there was certainly a skew towards the genetic end of things. And when we asked them in the focus groups why that was, some of them said, well, we just didn't know. And the default mechanism is always, well, it's genetics, isn't it? Anything, there's so much, they said genetics was so foregrounded that would be your default response. We asked them whether they agreed with this statement or not. So the statement says, there is much more genetic variation within a particular ethnic group than between one ethnic group and another. And I think this was trying to get at that misconception around genetics and ethnicity. And the fact that we had so many disagree or be neutral about this suggested that actually they do have this misconception. And when we talked about it, it really came, well, how were we supposed to know? Nobody's really ever talked to us about that before. So we had a lot of confusion and a lot of don't knows, but I think this statement really resonated with me. It said, I remember when we did that session, I was so upset that I'd gone my whole life thinking that like Black people's genetics was different enough that you would want to treat them differently. And I really felt that, growing up in Australia, I was told all sorts of things about the Aborigines, how they couldn't manage their alcohol because they didn't have enough alcohol dehydrogenase enzyme. That's a load of rubbish. I know that now. But at the time, it was the accepted explanation for why the Aborigines were often drunk and, well, that was the sort of standard thing that was said at the time, I'm afraid. So it's sort of, I feel like a lot of the time, particularly about certain ethnic groups, that some of the things I was told way back as I was going through my education were just actually wrong, which is a bit sad. So in conclusion, I think what we need to do is to have some clarity around ethnicity and genetic variation, really knock some of these misconceptions on the head. I think we need to make sure that we don't inadvertently give ethnicity or race a biological basis. So when I'm teaching about this clinical observation regarding ethnicity, say the hypertension guidelines, I need to make sure that I talk about the underlying mechanism, even if it's just to say that it's not genetic, and it's probably more to do with socioeconomic backgrounds and pollution exposure and all sorts of things like that, that actually, by the way, aren't particularly well studied in comparison to a lot of these genetic mechanisms. And I think we need to reevaluate the way we teach science and the scientific method. And I thought that comment about the scientific method was really interesting, because I don't have as much faith in the scientific method as I think a lot of scientists do, because I've seen so much of this data is just being reevaluated and coming up with a different answer. And I guess it's partly because I also teach statistics. And if you teach statistics and you try to teach from the point of view of, we want to take a sample. How do we sample? How do we make sure our sample is representative? Those clinical trials were done on Black Americans, but they're being translated into the British guidelines. What's that all about? Britain is an outlier in the hypertension guidelines. The Americans don't have those guidelines for hypertension drugs. It's just the British that do. Like, why? If science is so objective, how can that actually be possible? So science is not objective. It's done, and it's come from a place, it's come from the people who are interpreting that data. And we all know that if you have statistics and you have data, you can turn that data to whatever story you want it to be. So my current work is to start looking at a lot of the papers that were built into this body of knowledge around the pharmacokinetics and ethnic differences, and papers where you have n equals 8 Chinese and 8 whites. I kid you not, it is true. You look at statistical power of 30%. So that is a result of the scientific method, and I'm afraid I think there's a lot that is sort of wanting there. So why did we start with ethnic differences? Doesn't that say a lot about where we were coming from? Why did we think ethnic differences? And I think in this case, decolonization is about highlighting variation between individuals rather than between ethnic groups. And I worry that in all of this decolonization enthusiasm, which I think is fantastic, I worry that we focus too much on difference and we don't necessarily recognize the areas where we have similarities. Thank you very much.